Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Marissa Kozlov. It's great to have you with us for today's eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of media, ad tech, and martech. Today, we'll learn how loyalty is being redefined in the digital age and how brands can move beyond outdated loyalty models to create deep, lasting connections through personalized experiences. I'm really looking forward to this one. And I have two great guests joining me, so let's meet them. Bruce Richards, head of industry strategy, consumer goods, is coming to us today from Adobe and is based in New York. Bruce, welcome back. Great to have you.
Hey, Marissa, it's great to be back with you. You know, I enjoy always getting to spend time with you. Excited about this one. This is a great topic, and I'm really glad to be spending this time with you and Jess. I think we'll have some fun.
I agree. I'm happy to have you back and always nice to see you. And speaking of Jess, we have Jess Leitch, Vice President, Head of North America at Frog, who's in San Francisco. Jess, welcome.
Thanks very much, Marissa. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I am so looking forward to this conversation. These are some of my favorite topics. So before we get to that, I also want to ask our audience, like, where are you all joining us from? You heard that Bruce is in New York, Jess is in San Francisco. So please do put that in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're coming from. But please also use that chat to submit any questions that you have for the three of us. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can during the live Q&A in the second part of the show. So please make sure that you join us for that. Bruce and Jess have such great content planned for you today. Jess, I'm going to pass it to you so we can get started.
Thanks, Marissa. So, Bruce, 2024 was a pretty bad year for consumers and customer experience, huh?
It sure was, and we've talked about this for quite a while. Prepping for today, and
Yeah.
some of the information is absolutely staggering. So I'm really excited about digging in and not only setting the stage for what an abysmal year it was in 2024 for consumer
But
loyalty,
the only way
but
is up.
yeah, and hopefully, everybody will walk away today with some tips on how to overcome some of the statistics we're going to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think it was one of the toughest years on record for consumers. There's this report that Forrester runs. It's called the CX Index annually, and last year's index revealed that Americans are enduring their lowest quality customer experiences in a decade. And so the CX score that's measured by this index, it dropped to its lowest level since 2016. And so we're really in a bit of a well as far as CX is concerned. Um, just contextually, it seems like these scores, the cumulative scores, hit a bit of a high in 2021, which aligns with the pandemic. But they've steadily declined kind of year on year, with brands falling equally across areas of effectiveness and ease and emotion. And this decline in CX seems like it's also mirrored a broader trust drop for brands. So consumers are actually losing trust in brands as well. So it's just really interesting to think through. Back in 2021, consumer trust was pretty high. And I think that's because brands took a lot of meaningful steps to help consumers during the pandemic. They invested in digital channels and new systems and other CX improvements. And I think people really appreciated it. Like, they really appreciated that responsiveness. They appreciated being met where they were. And it really raised consumer expectations of brands, as well as their trust level in brands. And I think one of the statistics I've seen is that 87% of US consumers expressed loyalty to at least few brands back in 2021, but we've really seen a major decline since then. And in the past 18 months, we've seen economic factors really drive brands to shift their focus to cost reduction. So many are making investments in generative AI, but many brands have diverted spend away from CX programs that were focused on improving customer experience. And I think one of the statistics I saw was 60% of customer service and support leaders reported budget cuts in 2023. And so many of these brands have chosen to kind of take the money that they had and invest it into standalone loyalty programs, but really seems like that's having mixed results, and not having the exact results that they'd hoped. So we're really entering this kind of brutal reality that only 3% of consumers believe that the brands that are serving them, are truly customer obsessed, which is pretty damning. I mean, it's a pretty
Yes.
damning statistic.
Yeah, look, that number is staggering to me. And every time I look at it, I still shake my head and go, how is it possible?
Yeah,
Especially
yeah.
when you think about the fact that consumer demand for personalization has hovered around 75% for the last several years, and
Yeah,
you during the pandemic, a lot of brands took positive action towards personalization. But where did things fall apart? As consumers are demanding this personalization, it's remained pretty steady. 75, three-quarters of consumers across the board for the last 5 or 6 years have said, "I want personalization." And you know, we talk to brands every day where they say we're
yeah,
focusing on it. It's a strategic priority for us. So
yeah,
one has to wonder, where is the gap?
yeah,
Has the definition of customer obsessed changed in consumers' minds?
yeah,
Or are brands fooling themselves into thinking that they're doing a good job at this, or both? I mean, I think there's definitely the consumer part of it that personalization has changed in their
yeah,
heads, thinking about
yeah,
it differently than they did 5 years ago. And that's being driven by so many factors, and not the least of which is technology, Gen AI, all of which we'll get into today. But
yeah.
there's speed with which consumers' minds are changing, and I think that brands just aren't keeping up.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's harder than ever to actually deliver on the promises that are being made by, I think, by marketing and the marketing spend that's happening, especially when we're seeing kind of reductions to CX spend and to those
Yeah,
programs that were invested in, particularly during that pandemic period where we saw that big spike in customer trust and CX improvements. I think seeing that kind of rolled back and seeing spend go into different directions because of the economic environment, I think it's really exacerbated this experience gap, which is really interesting to note that I think we're going to talk about that today. Just the link between the growth in that experience gap and how that really impacts consumer loyalty, and how we've managed to kind of make those connections in a way that's I think really helpful, because it's always been a little bit of a gut instinct. I think that there was a connection between that experience gap
yeah.
and loyalty, but I think we've done a good job at kind of making that connection using some data.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you talked about DX spend, and you're right.
Yeah,
During the pandemic and coming out of it, there were so many brands who look. I like to call it. People tease me about it, but I call it the digital revolution.
yeah,
It's because the pandemic really drove it. There was no place else to go. Consume
yeah,
in a moment, every single thing that we knew went digital, right? So brands that didn't have their digital houses in order rushed to do that. So in a lot of ways, that enabled a lot of the positive consumer reaction to the brands that happened during the pandemic. But now there's this, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. There's this static mentality that created. Well, we did it. We're good. Let's move on and do something
yeah,
different, right? So, but I think one of the things that's really driving the experience gap is that brands are just not understanding the importance of personalizing at scale, right? And that scale word is the important one. We talk to brands every day. We both do, right? And they're saying, well, we personalize, but when we dig deeper and we peel back the covers a little bit, we find out that their personalization initiatives are very limited. They're doing it in
yep,
maybe one or two channels. That's just not good enough.
yep,
Personalization at scale, which is what it's sort of become our marching orders at Adobe when we talk to our customers. That's about doing it for every customer on every channel in real time. And if there are brands that are leaving one or more channels unattended, that just widens the gap for these brands.
yep,
So it's really important to understand that it's great that you've got certain things in your arsenal that are considered personalization. But when you're
yep,
doing it at scale and you're doing it effectively, the revenue implications are absolutely enormous. We're talking to customers who say, they've sort of split their initiatives where they're pure personalization across all channels and some that are more siloed. The personalization initiatives are driving 40% more revenue than the ones that aren't considered fully personalized.
yep,
That's a
yep, yeah,
big number.
yeah, it's
So,
huge.
I think it's that understanding of scale and how do you get that throughout your entire organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, I mean, it's really hard work to close this gap. And it is, as you said, it's more complicated than ever, because of the multiple channels that now require personalization to show up. There's so much
Right.
data to collect. And I know that brands feel like they're struggling to be able to make the best use of that data. And customers and consumers are increasingly expecting to see, if they share a piece of data, that it shows up in their experience. So I shared this with you, so you know this about me. So when are you going to show that in terms of the experience that you're delivering to me?
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, it really feels like in this situation, like the that this experience gap has grown even larger, and many brands have continued to kind of make promises via their marketing that they can't or aren't delivering upon when it comes to customer experience. And so I think I think you've got some research that I'm going to switch over to from Adobe that shows how the experience gap is actually impacting loyalty to a brand. So
Yep.
let's jump over to that.
Yeah, just just to set the stage a little bit, this is a research project that we've worked on that spans, a few different industries, and it's a global study. And we were trying to figure out, what was driving consumer loyalty as a concept, right? It's not about programs, and we'll talk about that. This was like, brand loyalty and what's causing consumers to churn. And, at the end of the day, what we found out, and there's a ton of data behind this. We tried to, cull it down to some real salient points here, but at the end of the day, tolerance for bad experiences is low
Hmm.
across the board, right? Consumers just in general are not putting up with bad experiences. But I mean, you can see based on that chart on the top, boomers tend to be a little bit more tolerant. They're willing to put up with a little bit more. But in general, the old three strikes and you're out rule just does not apply here when it comes to customer loyalty. They're not even giving you three chances to mess up. Consumers are walking away from brands after 2.4 bad experiences on average across a few industries. And it's taking more than six good experiences to get them to pledge their loyalty back. So
Hmm.
when you think about brands that are climbing that ladder to six and a half good experiences, a couple of slip ups along the way can really cost you that customer. And it's important to note that generationally, they define bad experiences differently. So for Gen Zs, the number one factor contributing to a bad experience was price. So Gen Z is just looking for better prices, where boomers, their priority is customer service or support. So in an economic environment like the one that we're in, price is always going to drive more churn a
Hmm.
lot faster than something like customer support. So boomers who tend to have a bit more disposable income, if they're getting the customer support that they need, they're going to be less likely to be price sensitive. Where Gen Zers are going to say, I don't care what kind of support I get. If the price isn't right, I'm going to look elsewhere. And you and I talked about this too. Looking
Yeah.
elsewhere is right here. It's at your fingertips. It's a button away, right? Everything's just a click
Yeah,
away.
it's easier than ever.
So easy. So
Yeah.
personalization isn't a one size fits all solution. Attention needs to be paid to the values of your most important cohorts and the things that they're talking about. So even, you can't put all of your consumers in one bucket. You have to understand that different generational cohorts are going to require different levels of personalization from you and tapping into different things that you know about them.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a really helpful way, I think, to articulate just how much a brand's failure to close this experience gap via successful personalization and loyalty initiatives can impact loyalty to a brand. So, once, people are not hanging around, they are switching after a very small number of negative experiences. And then it's much harder to actually build that loyalty. You have to work at it and work at it and work at it. And it's up to six good experiences. So, this is I think this research is really helpful for understanding that link between successful personalization, customer experience outcomes, and loyalty to a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we found out, because, these were just sort of top line numbers, but as we dug deeper, we wanted to learn, I mentioned how different generations are talking about different things that are important to them. One
Yeah.
thing that we learned was across the board, the combination of physical and digital experiences is becoming increasingly important to consumers. So we already talked about how during COVID, everything went digital, everybody
Yep.
focused on their digital experiences. Everything's coming back around now where consumers are forcing this balancing act of physical and digital. And though they're defined differently by industry, right? Retail, it's the store and the online
Hmm.
experience. airlines and travel and hospitality. It's digital plus the hotel experience and the airplane experience. All of those things come into play here. So the consumer is forcing this. So, and I think across the industries that we looked at, the convergence of physical and digital now is in the top three
Yep.
for what they're looking for from brands and what's causing them to walk away when they don't get it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, so on this topic, I mentioned, we talked about up front, I mentioned that with the cost, with this focus on cost, that a lot of brands have been investing the money that they do have to spend on CX into loyalty programs. You want to comment on that first? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, you know, investments in loyalty programs are fine.
Yeah.
We're not going to, you and I are not going to sit here and profess
No, no,
don't invest in loyalty programs. They're fine.
no.
And they're a really important part of a bigger mix,
Yeah,
so they're fine as long as brands understand that a program should only be part of a much bigger loyalty strategy. So it's
yeah,
moving from, when you talk to customers and you say, what does loyalty mean for you? So many of them automatically go to their program, right? Well, we have a loyalty program and it's points and rewards and it's all of those things. It's changing the mindset from that program to brand loyalty, right? And asking yourselves, is my customer loyal to my program or are they loyal to my brand?
yeah,
And that's a big ask, and that requires brands to really hold the mirror up and say, what are we prioritizing? And for the most part, rewards or points programs, they're transactional. They
yeah,
demonstrate to the consumer that they know what you bought, but they don't know you, right? So it's going deeper and making that emotional connection with consumers that tell the customer, I know you. And
yeah.
I know you participate in our program, but we know you are much bigger than the rewards that we give you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting in the US market in particular, it really does seem like the last 18 months have just really seen loyalty programs pick up steam here. Like I think some of the data I saw reported that at least 79% of consumers report that they participate in at least one paid loyalty program. And loyalty programs have seen really, huge growth in the last 12 months, at least 30%.
Yep.
And 9 out of 10 companies are planning to or have made investments in their loyalty programs as part of trying to do that customer retention play. With the idea, that retention is cheaper than acquisition, and this kind of matches up to the cost reduction story. And yeah, it just seems like, but it seems like a lot of these companies are really focused on gamification and rewards as part of the investments into loyalty. And I think your point is a really good one. Is this kind of the right thing to be focused on if we're trying to breed overall loyalty to a brand rather than necessarily engagement with a particular program? So I think that's the question, right? Is it a broader, are we thinking about loyalty as an outcome, or are we thinking about it as a program?
Yep. Yeah, I think it definitely has to be the latter.
Yeah,
It's interesting because you talked about gamification, you know,
yeah.
um, we don't have the stats on this, and this is purely a hypothesis of mine. But
Okay.
when we talk about gamification,
Yeah,
and you and I talked about this before,
yeah,
it's you know, what's driving this heightened level of participation in the US? And I think
yep,
part of it is consumers are almost gaming the loyalty system, right? They're playing points programs against one another. Where can I
yeah, for
get
sure.
value? Some of that may be driven by the economic environment. They're looking to
Yep.
get things in response for their rewards, so they're creating their own level of value exchange. But it's kind of interesting to see how much growth has happened in these programs, and I think that when brands see that consumers are responding by participating in their program, that automatically means they want to invest there. But they're not figuring out how to loop those programs into something that's much bigger and creating better experiences for their consumers.
Yeah, I agree. There's kind of an unintended consequence sometimes in these kind of points-based programs that it just drives potentially more of a transactional relationship, as you said, creating these kinds of this kind of competition between brands across programs. And when the real opportunity, I think, is to consider a loyalty program as part of a wider customer experience that you're delivering on, and using the data from that program to inform how you deliver other types of personalized experiences.
Absolutely. The data part of it is the critical thing here, right? So, um, loyalty programs are data rich.
Yes,
They,
absolutely.
so figuring out a way to overlay that data on what you already know about your consumer is magic. That's when you understand so much more about how your consumer is interacting with your brands. A perfect way to do that is, by pulling your loyalty data into, say, a CDP, which helps you create the most robust profile about your customer, and their shopping behaviors take on a whole new life than just this is what they bought. It's, points redemption, it's engagement with gamification. It's all of those things that help you, learn more about your consumer and then create a much better experience for them down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge opportunity to use that kind of first party data to really deliver those customized experiences that consumers expect. If you're gathering data on them, they expect to see that knowledge show up in their experiences that are delivered.
Yep, absolutely.
So it's really interesting, on that kind of topic of when we think about US brands, and when we're talking about loyalty in this market. What we found is that many are talking about loyalty programs when they're talking about loyalty, and we talked a little bit about the popularity of these kind of earn and burn point systems and member offers and tactical marketing, and sometimes we're seeing these designed in isolation and bolted on to the existing customer experience. This can be a function of the organizational structure and where the loyalty program sits. Sometimes it doesn't always sit with the CX or digital teams. And I think these kind of programs are widely accepted as a bit of a status quo, but they do seem to be slightly me too, sometimes a bit repetitive, and tending towards the transactional. And it's interesting. I think the investments that we're seeing in terms of more gamification seems to be focusing on improving that perceived transactional value. So offering member pricing or exclusive discounts or reward points for spending. But it's really interesting that actually this focus on improving these perceived transactional values have the potential to drive loyalty to the best offer, and really limit a brand's ability to build a long-term relationship, and potentially fuel this like unsustainable race to the bottom that you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's if it comes down to next best offer, and they're playing a program against one another, programs against one another. There's no winner there, except the consumer maybe gets a reward that they hadn't anticipated. But the other thing to think about here is industries where programs are few and far between. So I'll
Yeah,
use
absolutely.
consumer goods as an example.
Yep.
It's really difficult for CPG brands to stand up loyalty programs because they more often than not don't own the transaction. So we talked about points programs being transactional. If they don't own the transaction, there's no way for them to do that. The retailer owns that. So they get the benefit of the consumer data, and then they can feed things back. I mean, sure, brands participate and, give the retailer offers to offer to their consumer, but making the emotional connection for consumer goods brands becomes all the more difficult and all the more important. Because they have to leverage the engagement insights they have about their consumers to really build out those relationships and let them know we see you, we see what you're doing on our sites. Again, we come back to the pandemic and COVID.
Yeah.
If you talk to most CPG brands, in 2019, consumers were not visiting their sites in droves. All of a sudden, when products were not on shelves and they needed information about what was safe to bring into their home, that's when they started to visit these sites in a really, really big way. But the direct to consumer model took on a whole new life for them. It wasn't direct to consumer selling, it was direct to consumer engagement. And that's where brand loyalty for them became all the more important, because if you solved a problem for them that existed during the pandemic, you kind of had them. You sucked them in. They were loyal to your brand because you helped me, you solved my problem. But the
Yep.
smart brands found a way to leverage the data that came out of that to continually communicate with customers, whether they were directly selling them something or not. So in many ways, industries like that got the new loyalty concept earlier than others, right? Because they had to. They didn't own the program, so they had to figure out a new way to drive brand loyalty. So it's kind of this interesting dynamic that's happening across industry.
I think it's a really, really interesting point. I think about business companies like L'Oreal and others who are making these direct to consumer applications and using that as a way to build direct brand loyalty, not necessarily going through a retailer to do that, but creating facial analysis tools and really creating those experiences that people truly value and that does
Yes.
build loyalty to a brand, and it doesn't have to come in the form of a program.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, brands like L'Oreal, they're mirroring things that retailers are doing, right? So you've got L'Oreal doing it where, and they're mirroring, I'm not going to say who did it first, but you've got brands like Sephora that's doing very
Mhm.
similar things. So that ability to pull a customer in based on, a completely different level of engagement is really exciting to see across
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah, I agree. So it's really interesting that, despite this kind of attractiveness of these kinds of standalone loyalty programs, it seems that there is a risk that if they create these unrealistic expectations that rewards will continue to increase over time, and then potentially consumers get a little bit disappointed when that outcome isn't fulfilled. And in worst cases, it can actually encourage people to point shop and create this more transactional relationship, which is kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do as far as loyalty programs is concerned.
Exactly. I mean, that comes back to what we said earlier about playing a program against a different program. Where if you have programs with a couple of hotel chains, it's a game of who's going to give me, the best upgrade, or where can I use points to actually get a room, things like that.
Yeah,
So that, like we said, that does not breed brand loyalty. It
no.
breeds loyalty program loyalty.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. So, I think there is another way, and that, that's what we're talking about here today, and a way that really treats loyalty as more of a holistic outcome rather than that kind of more points-based approach or membership-based approach. And
Yeah.
I think the differentiator for that is that we position loyalty as an outcome of all of the consumer's interactions with the brand, and it positions loyalty programs as like a key part of the puzzle of loyalty, but really contextualizes those programs as part of like a wider brand and customer experience strategy. So, there, don't fear, there is another way.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm fearing we're setting a very bleak stage for these guys, Jess.
No, no, I think this is now
There
going
is
to go
another
in.
way. There's
There is
another
another
way.
way. Don't worry, don't worry.
Enter new loyalty.
Yes, exactly. So, so this idea of new loyalty is this experience-led strategy to really build retention and advocacy that kind of goes beyond points and offers, and it really positions loyalty as an outcome rather than a program or an initiative. And what it's about is allowing brands to stop seeing people as a data point or just purely as consumers, and treat them more like the people that we are, and see them as a whole person. So it's really about creating this genuine connection rather than necessarily relying on points and rewards. And there's kind of three key elements to it. So there's one that's around the idea that people create communities, not brands. And so brands have to align their experiences with consumers' core values around society and community and planet and social. And that gives brands a much better opportunity for longer lasting and more impactful relationships with their consumers. And consumers are really trying to be empowered. They want to be empowered to act purposefully and advocate for important topics that are important to them from a community standpoint. So I think that it's really important that brands acknowledge that. And then the second point I think is around starting with engagement first and trying to build authentic relationships with consumers. Whether it's through particular CX initiatives like we spoke about before, that brands like L'Oreal or Sephora are engaging in. Really, this kind of new loyalty starts with engagement before it expects loyalty from a consumer. And then I think, the key outcome and the differentiator is that it's all about measuring the success of loyalty against a new set of outcomes. So, one that positions kind of loyalty as an outcome of all of your branded experiences rather than necessarily engagement with a standalone program or a membership scheme.
Yep. Yeah. I love this concept of new loyalty. I mean, at Adobe, we kind of hang our hats on the notion that consumers buy experiences, not products. And we
Yep.
profess that to all of our customers. It's kind of part of our DNA. And that's why we have all of our conversations with customers about creating outstanding experiences with our solutions, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a different way of saying what's on this slide. But if you break this down, you know, um, you know, the first line, build retention and advocacy. Okay, that's a lot less expensive than acquisition. So why wouldn't you want to focus on it? And it's, I mean, a lot less expensive. Um, Focusing on community, starting with engagement, measuring the outcomes. This all comes back to what we started talking about when we opened this session is customer obsessed becoming redefined, but in the consumer's mind. So consumers are now looking for a sense of community in their engagement with brands. It's being driven by social media, influencers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there are so many factors that are playing into how the consumer views brands and engages with them that I really do believe there's this redefinition of what customer obsessed means. It doesn't mean that I got through checkout quickly. It means that there's a level of personalization and customization and exclusiveness and all of these things that come along with making me feel special. That's customer obsessed. So I love this whole idea of new loyalty.
I think you are so on the money with that point. I do think that the reason that that number is so low is because the expectations have changed dramatically for what consumers expect from brands. And
Yes.
every time they give another piece of data over, that expectation is elevated, that they're going to see the results of that additional piece of information reflected in what a brand knows about them and the experience that they delivered to them. And those are the key moments of loyalty. Going back to the data points that you had shared around, positive and negative experiences and how that impacts brand switching and ultimately brand loyalty. I really do think that this world that we're living in with more channels, more data means that expectations are much higher and it's much further to fall.
Yeah, yeah. I'll throw another stat at you, Jess.
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. On average, consumers engage with a brand through 7 different channels before they pull the trigger and buy. 7. So
Yeah,
in and of itself is absolutely incredible. So the number of channels through which a consumer can engage with a brand has grown in leaps and bounds over the last several years. But this is
yeah,
even scarier. They're getting through 7 channels of interaction exponentially faster than they were 2 or 3 channels a few years ago because they're just becoming so much more adept. It's like, well, what if I go here? What if I talk? What if I, what if I go on my socials and I see something else? So they're going back and forth before they're pulling the trigger, and they're doing it with this incredible amount of speed. So again, that comes back to that redefinition of customer obsessed. If you can't meet me on all of those channels when I'm there and know where I've been before, you're kind of missing the boat.
yeah. Bruce, I
So
think that's our next piece to work on together is redefining customer obsession.
there you go. New loyalty, new customer
Yeah,
obsession.
yeah.
I'm in.
All right. So we've got a few shifts that are part of new loyalty as a concept that's going to that we think are going to take us from this kind of more transactional view of loyalty that's kind of program based and around membership programs and move us towards this kind of definition of new loyalty that we were just talking about then. So we're seeing 4 major shifts that we think is going to support that transition from transactional to more holistic loyalty. So the first one is this idea of static to adaptive. And so this means loyalty approaches that are going to adapt and evolve as consumers interact with them. And, we see brands making use of tools like generative AI to actually allow consumers to determine what brand loyalty looks like to them, almost on a one-to-one basis rather than having a specific point of view imposed on them by a brand, which really creates this opportunity for brands to be a lot more responsive, but also it turns it from a push relationship from the brand to a pull relationship from the consumer. So I think that's one of the big trends. You want to comment on that one, Bruce?
Look, out of the 4 here, static and adaptive is kind of the one that I'm really gravitating towards because for me it drives to a certain degree the other 3, right? Um, we're in an environment that does not allow for static. It just doesn't. Standing up a solution and checking the box is no longer good enough. There has to be, whether you call it adaptive or agile, brands need to culturally shift their mindsets to stay current with what the consumers are asking for. And then also what the industry is providing them with. So did you say Gen AI, right? I mean, so right? I mean, so adaptive means you have to look at that and go, how do we adopt this in a way that is going to make sense not only for our consumers but also for not only for our back of house, but for our consumers. You know, um, I was in a meeting yesterday and we were talking about how brands are anticipating this shift in Gen AI adoption, where we've only been talking about this for 2 years. It seems like we've been talking about it forever, but it's only been 2 years, and most brands were implementing it in their organizations, addressing operational efficiencies. Right. And now what they're saying is, as of the end of last year, they're saying within 3 years' time, almost 60% of brands are going to be implementing Gen AI capabilities focused on growth. Now, operational efficiencies often feed growth, but that's going to be the focus. They're not going to say we can just do things better and faster. We're going to say we can do things better and faster, and here is the end result from a growth perspective. So that's about being adaptive and being able to move along with the industry. And the industry is inclusive of the consumer and all of the technological advancements that come along from companies like Adobe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. I think static to adaptive is definitely the number one shift I think that we're going to see to make this transition. The
Mhm.
other really interesting one I think is this fragmented to holistic. And so, we've been talking a lot about how these traditional like loyalty or membership programs, they're often fragmented, disconnected from a brand's core experience. But this concept of kind of new loyalty incorporates standalone loyalty programs, and they're super rich, like first party data into the center of a brand's CX ecosystem, and really uses that data as the foundation to deliver, that holy grail of true personalized experiences that we're really looking for.
Yep.
Um, the next one on individual to collective, I think, is about really driving impact through community. So, 49% of adults are more likely to join a loyalty program if its values align with their own. So that concept of moving from treating people as an individual to understanding the context within how they're operating and what their values are is really important. And co-creation is a big element of that as well.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, co-creation is really important. And it's how allowing consumers to create their own experiences with your brand is becoming incredibly exciting, and
Yeah,
Gen AI
yeah.
is driving so much of that. We did work with, Gatorade, where we're allowing athletes to, express their athletic journeys on customized water bottles that they're using Gen
Mm.
AI to build, and it's incredible to watch the response from consumers when they get to actually play with Gen AI tools. First of all, it helps them build trust around these Gen AI solutions, because there's always been the first year that we talked about Gen AI, there was this big mystery. Well, what does this mean to me as a consumer, right? And most of the applications were back of house. I talked about operational efficiencies, things like that, moving towards growth. Part of moving towards growth is putting those tools in the hands of consumers and letting them play and
Yeah.
actually interact with the brand. So that's kind of cool.
It's super cool. It's super cool. And then
Yep.
that last shift is really about, moving from consumptive to regenerative. And that's the promise of actually using these loyalty initiatives. They actually shift people's behavior. And so they're very powerful when they're deployed
Mhm.
successfully. And so there is an opportunity to kind of look at different ways to shift behaviors as a community and societally as part of this as well, which I know is really important in particular for CPG.
Oh yeah. I mean, in many ways, the consumer goods industry owns this, right? They're the ones
Yes.
that are producing the products that end up on shelves and on websites.
Yeah.
So as consumers, especially Gen Zs, we talked about, generational cohorts earlier, when we talk about Gen Zs who place a very high value on things like sustainability, as they explore products, transparency about what your brands are doing to address these issues is going to go a long way. But interestingly, though, one of the things I've been talking a lot about with my CPG customers is how private labels are
Mm.
eating up so much of their market share. And last year, private labels had, I think it was a 4% year over year increase in dollar sales, where established brands only had a 1% growth.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, so it's really been an incredible phenomena to watch private label brands take market share away from established brands. And what this also does is it gives retailers an advantage because they're the ones developing these private label brands. And for the most part, they've had their data houses in order for a lot longer than a consumer goods brand. So it makes it so much easier for them to personalize those communications about sustainability where it's appropriate, where consumer goods brands have to figure that out, right? So there's this sort of cross industry dynamic that's happening that ultimately erodes market share, but at the end of the day, erodes loyalty, right?
Mm,
Because there's this and there's this other thing happening called dupe culture, right? There,
mm,
when you talk about Gen Zs and younger generations, it's actually like it's a social um, group that where they're going after, they're actively seeking out dupes to branded products that they use because they figure they're cheaper. And they're
yep,
also finding out that a lot of times the product is the same, if the product is the same quality, if not better.
yep,
So there's a
yep.
whole thing happening out there that's, it's not only eroding market share, it's eroding brand loyalty.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's like double click into a little bit of the detail on like how to make each of these shifts real. And like let's start by looking at this static to adaptive shift. And I think the idea of this is really using new and adaptive technologies to empower brands to deliver those kind of really personalized loyalty experiences and do it with better scale and better speed and better consistency. And we were talking a little bit about Gen AI, and I really feel like it's becoming table stakes, and consumers really expect brands to use it for personalization and for improving loyalty outcomes as well. I think I saw a statistic that said like 75% of respondents that we looked at as part of putting this material together had a favorable attitude towards the use of Gen AI and its role in kind of creating these unique experiences for consumers and
Yep.
for driving kind of buying and engagement behavior. So there's really this expectation that brands should be using these technologies to their fullest extent to make sure that this promise of kind of hyper personalized experiences are real.
hmm Yeah, I think a couple of things. Yes, consumers are excited about it. They're interested in it. They want transparency. They want to know, if brands are using it, they want to know how and why. That's the first thing. Look, we tend to, I told you I love this whole idea of adaptive,
Yeah,
because when we talk about CX, it's like we tend to put consumer experience into three buckets. It's a complex topic, right? So
yeah,
what we talk to our customers about is you need to consider three things. It's data and insights, it's
hmm,
content creation and production, and then orchestrated journeys. And at the center of that, it's the data piece of it. So data
yep,
and insights, we've talked about pulling the data in from loyalty programs, using it to build the most robust profiles, but then but then using AI and Gen AI to do microsegmentation, understanding consumer sentiment, all of those things, and layering that into your data and insight solutions. But then on the content side, it's the possibilities are endless because that's when you start to pull in, how do you use what you know about the customer to make sure you get the right content in front of them? And that's often driven by AI, ML, and now Gen AI for the creation of those assets. So that's really, really exciting. And then using those two pieces, the data and insights about them, you've got the content. How do you orchestrate that journey to create that great connection with those consumers that's going to keep them coming back?
yeah. I totally agree. I can see this world where with automated content creation, brands can get a lot of time and resources and really create this kind of very personalized set of propositions and pieces of content that feel like that can help the consumer feel like they're really being listened to and that their data is really being well utilized.
Yeah, and if you talk about that whole concept of operational efficiency versus growth, that's where
Yeah,
that comes into play because
yeah,
they're almost married there, right?
yeah, yeah,
Content creation, you can democratize that and let marketers do it instead of creatives because things can be templatized. They can push a
yeah,
button. They've got their email output without having to go back to the creative teams. And then because that is so personalized and so customized to the consumer, the growth opportunities are there. So that's
yeah.
pulling
It's
together
huge.
both sides of the fence.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. The other thing I'm really excited about on this front is this idea of um, changing generative AI being used as the primary means of engagement for like a singular and personalized conversation between a consumer and a brand, and really having this based more on natural language and really allowing brands to solve problems for customers, consumers in a much more natural way than they have done in the past. So doing away with like IVRs and the formats that we're using, which kind of tend to box people into potentially journeys that they don't feel comfortable in.
Yeah, well, that natural language component is really important. In fact,
Yeah.
at Adobe, every year we recap the holiday season and we say, what are the things that we saw that really stood out for us? And in
Yeah.
addition to mobile and payment mechanisms and all of those things, the one thing that our mouths literally fell open when we saw the stat. If you know how when you go on a Gen AI tool and you're searching for things and it gives you the
Yeah.
link.
Yeah.
Okay. The usage of those links in retail for this holiday season grew 1,300%.
Wow.
Consumers are clicking on those links, and what they're doing is they're researching product and price. They built their holiday lists out of it and then actually transacted. So those links are becoming more and more important. So that begs a question, when we talk about personalized experiences and what brands need to do, how do brands make sure that when those Gen AI engines are scraping the internet to find the answers to the questions, that they end up at the top of that list?
Yeah.
And we presented this finding at NRF, and a lot of brands said to us, "Well, okay, how do we do that?" We looked at each other and said, "We don't know. We just found this out. We have to help you figure it out together because it's a really, I mean, obviously it's an SEO issue, but it's an interesting problem to have that can really change the dynamic of the business.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
kind yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
it's kind of the next version of SEO, right? It's like it's
yep,
actually about training large language models to represent a brand in a specific way that
yeah,
you would like it to be represented. But we're
right.
gonna have to hustle to go through the rest of these and get
I
some
know, I
questions done.
know.
I know we're running out of time. So let's look a bit at fragmented to holistic. So the idea behind this one is that 64% of consumers switch retailers because joining a membership program or sharing shopping data didn't result in a better customer experience. So what that tells us is that brands really want and really need to do a better job of connecting experiences across channels. So that means incorporating your standalone loyalty program and that rich data into the center of the CX ecosystem. I think part of the Adobe research I saw too was that 75% of respondents stated that a connected omni-channel loyalty experience was a big factor to make them loyal to a brand.
Yep.
So, where does that tell us? It means that these membership offers, these loyalty programs, they have to be more holistic. They have to be embedded across all touch points as this kind of golden thread that really comprehensively does a better job at comprehensively addressing a broader spectrum of customer needs and, showing up in all different stages of the journey.
Yeah. Look, I know we're running short on time, but
Yeah.
we've kind of beaten this one to death, right? We can't stress this point enough.
No, it's
Relying
so
on
important
program,
though. If
right?
there's one thing.
Relying on programs alone to drive brand loyalty is a recipe for failure. Full
Absolutely.
stop. They
Yeah.
have to become a piece of a much broader reaching loyalty puzzle. And I talked about the data and insights, content creation, orchestrated journeys. All of those things are important. That data and insights is the foundation that brands need to rely on, and loyalty
Yeah.
programs give them so much rich data, pull it in, use it, and create a more robust profile for your consumers.
Love it. So, individual to collective, couple of practical things to try and make this real as a transition. The best membership programs, the best loyalty programs, the best loyalty initiatives help consumers feel as if they're advancing their collective and really lean into that core human need to belong and create meaningful shared experiences. And so, the idea of this is really about brands integrating community into their new initiatives and empowering members and consumers who are part of that community to have a greater impact as part of the collective. We mentioned co-creation is one thing. Consumers are overwhelmingly agree that when brands co-create with consumers, they're much more trustworthy, more authentic, and more desirable. So, those kinds of co-creation collaborations can create more engaging, more user-centric experiences that people actually feel ownership over. And that's really the outcome we're looking to hit. And the other thing is, driving this impact through community. So I think I mentioned this stat before, 49% of adults are more likely to join a loyalty program if its values align with their own. So through these kind of dedicated customer interactions, brands can really establish the values and issues that matter to their members and community. And by supporting and incentivizing that membership community to kind of harness the collective, you can really support local neighborhoods, local communities, and really drive that kind of purposeful change as a collective.
Yeah. 100% agree. The one thing I would focus on here, when we talk about meaningful shared CX and communities, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of influencers. And to a very large degree, they're reshaping brands on behalf of the communities that they're involved with. And we know that, from Gen Zs, more than half of Gen Zs have bought products through social media in 2024, and that was up from the mid 40s in 2023. So the proportion of consumers that are leaning into social media and using the information that they get back to make purchasing decisions is really, really important. But on the flip side, the brands who are now engaging with the influencer community and to a large degree are paying those influencers, to be part of their world is really exciting to watch. So that whole idea of community and shared CX, it's not going away, and it's going to
No.
get big. Going to get
No,
bigger.
no, no, no. And this is really an area where it can pay to loosen the reins a little bit and to be able to allow people to create their own perspective on what a brand means to them and means to their community. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely not going away. The role of influencers seems to be growing year on year. All right, this is the last transition. So I think, I'd mentioned that, brands really just have an opportunity here to break this paradigm that loyalty drives unnecessary consumption. And we can do a lot through enabling more sustainable choices. And actually, 92% of consumers say that they want to make more sustainable choices. And so there's a huge opportunity for, CPG brands and others to close this kind of say-do gap through their loyalty initiatives. And using these programs to reward more sustainable choices. So I'm going to try and wrap that one up quickly because Marissa's back and we've got some
Yeah, I know.
questions.
I saw Marissa pop up, but I went, uh-oh, who's going to stop us?
Yeah.
I think I've covered this one off, Jess. I talked
Yeah.
about how, CPG brands own this, but there's a
Yeah.
lot to learn from how brands deal with that across industry. So no need to belabor that. It's important and more important to certain generations, but overall, I think most consumers have a level of concern about it.
Awesome. Hi, Marissa.
All
Hey,
right. Well,
Marissa.
that was awesome. I mean, I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that you two are extremely passionate about the topic. So thank you so much for amazing content today. We are going to take one question before we close. Bruce, I have to admit, our chat was blowing up when you shared one statistic earlier. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this one. Bruce,
What was
earlier today, you mentioned that 90% of consumers have a negative perception in loyalty programs overall. That surprised a lot of our audience. So can you explain where this negative perception comes from? What are you seeing?
I don't think I said that, Jess. I think you're the one who. That's okay.
All right, sorry about that, Bruce. Jess,
That's okay.
please,
I'll toss to Jess,
please
and then
let us
I'll
know.
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So I think that where is that coming from? It's coming from the fact that they're expecting that the data that they're giving to these brands is showing up in the experiences that are delivered, and it's not. So we're seeing this disconnection between what's being learned between what's being learned as part of these loyalty programs and what's actually being delivered from an experience standpoint. So that's where this negativity is coming from, because people expect that if they share data with you that the brand is going to reflect that in a personalized experience, and it's just not happening.
Mm.
Yep, exactly. They're looking for the value exchange, and when they're not getting it, they're
Yeah,
getting it, and they're going, but wait, you're enticing me to spend more and more money with you, and you're not going to use that information to
yeah,
favor me. I'll walk away.
yeah,
And again, the power of the fingertip.
Those
yeah,
are those
yeah,
are great points. I mean, that sounds just so frustrating. So I completely
yeah.
I hear what you're saying. Thank you for clarifying that. Hopefully that helps to answer the question. A lot of people chimed in on that one. So thank you both so much. Bruce, Jess, it was so wonderful to be with both of you today. Thank you for such great content and for answering that audience question from so many in the audience today. Appreciate you both being here.
Appreciate you. This was a lot of fun. Jess, always fun to have these conversations. And Marissa,
Yeah.
you guys.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, let me just take a moment to tell you about eMarketer's media channels. You can register for live analyst and tech talk webinars on our events page at emarketer.com/events. Don't forget to check out our various podcasts. We have Behind the Numbers, Reimagining Retail, and also the Banking and Payments Show. Listen everywhere you find podcasts and also watch on Spotify and on eMarketer's YouTube channel. And finally, please subscribe to our newsletters. Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks again to Bruce, Jess, the teams at Adobe and Frog, and our eMarketer Studio team behind the scenes for making today's webinar possible. We'll see you all on the next Tech Talk.